In respect to Facebook's actions today, Facebook was wrong. Facebook's actions were unnecessary. They were heavy-handed and they will damage its reputation here in Australia. Their decision to block Australians' access to government sites, be they about support through the pandemic, mental health, emergency services, the Bureau of Meteorology, were completely unrelated to the media code. But what today's events do confirm for all Australians is the immense market power of these media digital giants. These digital giants loom very, very large in our economy and on the digital landscape.
This is outrageous and unacceptable. We expect that Facebook will fix these actions immediately and never repeat them again. This is an assault on a sovereign nation. It is an assault on people's freedom, and in particular, it is an utter abuse of big technologies, market power and control over technology.
Welcome to another episode of the Josie to Lagos podcast. This is a podcast that seeks to explore issues that affect Africa from an African perspective, to create knowledge and depth about the African continent, looking at current affairs, looking at politics, looking at trade, looking at economics, with a deeper intention to try to uncover that fundamental question that every African asks themselves. Why is Africa not performing at her full potential? So what you were listening to at the beginning were the voices of Australian lawmakers, specifically the Treasurer of Australia, that's what they call their minister there, Josh Frydenberg, and their Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher. And they were responding to what Facebook recently did to the users of Facebook in Australia. Australia fundamentally had a confrontation with Facebook in February that is worth talking about and worth considering from an African perspective. This confrontation concerned a law that the Australian government wanted to pass that would make Google and Facebook pay news publishers for the content that appears on their platforms, or failing to reach an agreement with those particular platforms to negotiate for payments, and if that negotiation failed, to go to an arbitration, which would be done by an Australian arbitrator. So this is interesting because it's a legislation from a sovereign state, and Mark Zuckerberg is on record actually saying that he is in favor of legislation. He wants Facebook to be legislated. In fact, listen to these clips from Mark Zuckerberg and from some reporting about what he said around his position on regulation.
One way to regulate a company is through competition, through government regulation. Here's the question that all of us got to answer. What do we tell our constituents, given what's happened here, why we should let you self-regulate? What would you tell people in South Carolina that, given all the things we've just discovered here, it's a good idea for us to rely upon you to regulate your own business practices?
Well, Senator, my position is not that there should be no regulation. Okay. I think the internet is increasingly
important. Do you embrace
important.
Regulation?
I think the real question, as the internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not.
But you as a company welcome regulation?
I think if it's the right regulation, then yes.
You think the Europeans have it right?
I think that they get things right.
Have you ever submitted? That's true. So would you work with us in terms of what regulations you think are necessary in your industry?
Absolutely.
Okay. Would you submit to us some proposed regulations?
Yes, and I'll have my team follow up with you so that way we can have this discussion across the different categories where I think that this discussion needs to happen.
Look forward to it.
Well, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is calling for more oversight online. Zuckerberg is jumping into the debate around regulating the internet and calling on governments to take a more active role in policing violent content. Laura McQuillan is tracking the story and joins us now. So this is all in an op-ed by Zuckerberg. What does he have to say, Laura?
Well, this is at odds with what we've heard from him in the past, John, because Zuckerberg has been resistant to regulation of platforms like Facebook, but now we're seeing him come out and call for rules for the internet, and he wants governments to act. He even wants third parties to help act and to crack down on social media when it's not getting it right itself.
So there you have it. Facebook CEO who says, listen, I'm open to regulation. It has to be the right regulation, but I'm open to regulation. And, writing an op-ed saying that governments ought to participate in regulating the internet. And all of these statements were made at the time when people were very, very critical of Facebook. People were saying Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, and Netflix have too much power, and all of the power is concentrated in their hands, and something needs to be done. So around about that time, there were a lot of inquiries, a lot of governments trying to speak to Google and Facebook specifically. So Mark Zuckerberg said, listen, I'm open to regulation. I'm open to all of these things. But the behavior of Facebook in Australia paints a different picture. So let's talk about that. Let's explore what happened in Australia, and then also think about how this applies to Africa. But before I go too far, let's do an overview of where does Australia sit in the global scheme of things. Number one, Australia is the 13th largest economy in the world. It has the 10th highest per capita income. It is, as you know, both a country and a continent. It is the 6th largest country by land area. The population, though, is not as high as you might anticipate. Try to guess. How big do you think Australia is in terms of population? South Africa is getting close to 60 million. The UK is also getting close to 60 million. How big do you think Australia is? America is about 300 million. So in your estimation, where do you think Australia falls in that picture? I'll give you a few seconds just to take a guess. Don't Google. I won't give you long enough to check Google. But guess. Do you have a number? Right. The Australian population is 25 million. Of that 25 million, its Facebook user base is 17 million people, which represents approximately 68% of the population. So it's a large user base from the Australian perspective, but from the Facebook perspective, it's not that large of a user base, because globally, Facebook has about 2.8 billion users. And Australia is not high ranking in terms of their foot traffic and their business traffic, but it is a major economy. Africa, more interestingly, has more users, and Africa has 140 million users a month. And this is using 2018 data. It's probably gone up a little bit. And 98% of the user base of Facebook is connecting via mobile. So while this happens in a population of 17 million people, I think it's important for Africa as a whole, because you've got 140 million users using this platform. We have to think about what lessons can we learn from how Australia engaged with Facebook. So here's a timeline of events, just so that you can get a full picture of everything that happened. In July of 2019, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission released a digital platforms inquiry report, and this was their final report. It was the conclusion of an 18-month process of examining the impact of digital platforms on the media. The final report identified a few things, and one of the things that it identified was that there is a fundamental bargaining power imbalance between Australian news media businesses and companies such as Google and Facebook. The report then recommended the introduction of industry codes of conduct, but these industry codes of conduct were initially meant to be voluntary in terms of finding ways to restore the bargaining power. In December of 2019, there was a shift, and the Australian government then took up the issue and asked the Competition Commission to work with Google and Facebook to make this voluntary code of conduct. Nothing much came out of it. The talks were not as fruitful. In April of 2020, so about 4 months after that, so now we're getting closer to crunch time, Then the Australian government took a different move now because the voluntary process had failed. They then asked for their Competition and Consumer Commission to develop a mandatory code of conduct to address the bargaining power imbalances which exist between the news businesses and Facebook and Google. Now, things had moved from this voluntary code process to this mandatory code process, and now we're entering the realm of legislation. In July of 2020, the commission, the Competition Commission, announced the draft code, which was aimed at addressing this acute bargaining power imbalance that they had identified. In August and September of last year, Facebook and Google at the time issued threats and ultimatums effectively that they would be forced to prevent Australian users from sharing and accessing local and international news on their platforms if the proposed legislation went ahead. Google moved away from that position and started making deals with various news providers in Australia, paying them for their content and making contractual arrangements with them. Facebook, however, stuck to its guns. And on the 17th of February, 2021, Facebook blocked Australians from accessing or sharing local and international news. So basically, Facebook also blocked the international community from being able to access Australian news. So the way that this worked is that all of the news links that you can often click on, they were unclickable. There would be an error and you wouldn't be able to actually enter into a news story or publication. But more than that, Facebook went over and above just blocking news from news providers. What Facebook also did is that they blocked access to government pages and to pages of various organizations such as charities. They removed over 100 non-news pages, including health and emergency agencies. And a lot of people pointed out that this was very reckless behavior. Already you know and appreciate that 17 million people out of a population of 25 million are getting their content through Facebook. Facebook is widely used in Australia, and that includes their news content. So when you block government departments, charities, NGOs from distributing information in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the rollout of vaccination programs, what you actually do is you adversely impact that society and that community. Facebook was resoundingly criticized, and that goes back to that sound clip that you heard at the beginning. It came just after Facebook had done its ban on these news platforms. On the 24th of February, what then happened is that Facebook announced that it was going to invest $1 billion into the Australian news industry over the next 3 years as a sign of commitment to journalism. This came actually after there had been negotiations with government officials on amendments to the News Media Bargaining Code. So after Facebook had banned the news in Australia, they then entered into negotiations, discussed with the Australian lawmakers how to rectify the situation, and they came to some modifications of the law and also this commitment of $1 billion to Australian news companies in the next 3 years. On the 25th of February, the legislation was passed. It was an amended legislation, but it was passed, and it's called the News Media Bargaining Code. It was passed by the House of Representatives in Australia and then went through the Senate. In the amendments, the government say that parties involved will get a 2-month mediation period to broker deals before they are made to enter into arbitration. The original legislation had said 45 days. But also what they gave Facebook as a proviso as well is that they would consider other media deals that had been entered into, and that Facebook would retain its right to, decide if news appears on its platform at all, so that it won't be automatically be subject to a forced negotiation. So Facebook retains that same authority to block news content and access in Australia, but the law did pass. So having looked at all of that, what are the issues at hand? There are 4 issues that I want us to think about today. Number 1 is accumulation of power. Number 2 is interference in lawmaking. Number 3 is controlling the future of news. And number 4 is entrenching Western narratives in Africa. I'm going to go through each of those in turn. What we see here in the case study of Australia is that Facebook has accumulated a vast amount of power, and that power has now extended into the political and civic space in ways that we must consider. The platform business model of Facebook has had an impact beyond the market. Externalities arising from its network effects have given Facebook vast amounts of political power. The amount of power that Facebook has accumulated in the political sphere is such that now it actually poses a real threat to democratic models. Just think about some of the examples. Lawmakers have said that they're afraid of Facebook coming against them because of its lobby influence in America. Facebook effectively banned the president of the United States of America, or a former president of the United States of America, from using their platforms. So that's saying to all of the lawmakers, all of the legislators, that we don't care about you and we don't fear you in their home country. Now, we can disagree, and many of us, I think, are not in support of the Capitol Hill riots, the insurrection. We're not in support of the rhetoric that Donald Trump had. But the fact that Facebook was one of the companies that could actually pull the finger towards one of their former presidents indicates that they have this power and authority and they're not afraid to use it. The fight with Australia is another exhibition of that power, and it's something that I think we must be cognizant of, because Facebook has shown that they are willing to confront powerful governments of powerful economies when they disagree with what those sovereign states are doing. You know, when we consider the separation of powers doctrine, in a democracy, the way that we've designed these democracies, the functional democracies, is that power is not concentrated in one place. It's not given to one person. It's not concentrated in the hands of one person. And what we then do is we separate and we create three structures of governance. We create the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. The executive administers the state. That's where you have the president, the ministries, and all of that. They run the day-to-day affairs of the country. The lawmakers make the laws which run the country, and the executive has to account to the lawmakers in parliament, and their periodic letters and debates and announcements and budgets are debated, and all of those people can be taken to the judiciary, which also is run separate from parliament and from the executive. That's why judges have tenure, and that's why they're chosen through a very special process, so that once they're chosen, there isn't a lot of interference. That's the separation of powers doctrine. And there is accountability infused in that. Accountability for lawmakers comes from the fact that you as the voter can remove them if they don't deliver according to your mandate. Accountability comes from the fact that you can watch them in parliament and make sure that you are satisfied with the issues that are happening. Accountability in the judiciary works through parliament. It works through citizens being able to access trials, to watch judicial proceedings, to read judgments. That's the reason why the court process is as transparent as it is, and why even you, any citizen, can walk into a court, sit down and watch the proceedings, right? That's so that the power that the entities who govern have is always under strict supervision and is balanced out within the system. So that's what you have in the separation of powers doctrine and in having these three separate arms of the state. Now, Facebook, on the other hand, does not account to the public in the way that other institutional brokers of power do. Facebook is a for-profit company, and in the first instance, its motives are not in line with the motives of lawmakers and other social leaders in a society who are trying to preserve the institution of democracy, trying to make sure that governance happens in a way that is streamlined and delivers to the people. And I'm talking about functional democracies here, not some of the stuff that happens in Africa. But Facebook executives only account to each other and to their shareholders, and their deliberations are not done transparently in front of the people. And that also reduces accountability. Their decisions rarely have an appeal process, and there's no way for civilians to challenge the structure of Facebook. That has a bigger bearing when you're a smaller country and when you don't have as much power as powerful economies with prominent leaders who have some stature on the global stage. So that's the first thing around what we learn from the Australian case study. The second thing is that Facebook was effectively interfering with the lawmaking process of a sovereign state. As an American company, a foreign actor, if you recall with the Russia scandal, when it was Trump and Hillary, the accusation was made that, the Russians had used Cambridge Analytica and several other platforms to basically steal the election. And Americans were enraged when this was done by Russia and Cambridge Analytica. Lawmaking is a critical part of the democratic process. It's as important as the voting process, and foreign actors should not get to determine the laws of sovereign states. Now think about what Facebook did. Facebook went to the Australian public and lawmakers and said, if you implement a law that we don't like, we will block the news in your country. We don't care. And we are willing to do that to the detriment of your country, to send even a message to other countries. That is some scary stuff. That's a company that is saying we can come to a continent, a country, and say to you, we don't care. We don't care. We don't give a hoot about your institutional structures. That's quite problematic from the Facebook side. And I think we ought to be very, very aware that this is what Facebook has done. Let's go to the third thing. Controlling the future of news. Facebook is developing its own news platform right now. And this news platform that they're developing could alter the news landscape further than it has already been altered and disrupted. This platform that they're developing is called Facebook News. It's a dedicated and curated news portal which is accessed through a tab in Android or iOS. And on Facebook News, users are provided with a list of curated top stories for the day. They provide you a list of personalized stories based on news sources you might already follow or interests that you have. And these may be from publications that you don't already follow. And they are dedicated news sections for sports, entertainment, health, science, and technology. But it's critical to know, as with anything Facebook, it's algorithm dependent, right? So while users may indicate what stories they like and what they don't want to see, what they don't want to see, Facebook still controls the algorithm. So Facebook has been working on this algorithm-based news provision to people, and that should be something that worries people already, because Facebook is not transparent with its algorithms. And basically, Facebook decides you don't care about an issue. Unless you now go and look for it, you won't particularly see news on that particular story. And that should be of alarm to everybody. Facebook News has been launched in the US and in the UK and is expanding to other territories. And what Facebook has basically done, it has entered into licensing deals with many news publications, mostly in the West. Some companies have, though, refused to take part because the financials of the whole arrangement don't favor them, and they risk losing out on subscription revenue and having to rely on Facebook payments. So Facebook is basically trying to do what Apple did with iTunes and what Netflix did with, movies and series and all of that with news. This Facebook news platform that they are proposing and pushing out could actually change the nature of African news companies and who gets a voice, because Facebook is the one that goes out there and enters into these transactions and deals. And already African media houses have been seeing a decline in their revenues, and they've struggled even more than Western publications. So when you then have Facebook reshaping news, you ought to be worried about, their behavior in engaging territories and sovereign nations. And the impact of all of this goes to the fourth thing, is that it could actually entrench the Western narrative on Africa. If Facebook right now is funding international news giants and is only being responsive to the actions of countries such as America, UK, and Australia in terms of paying for news in those territories, what this means is that it will be the Western world and the Western media news houses which will continue to tell African stories and to provide the perspective on Africa. And that's worrying because they've oftentimes had the wrong perspective on Africa. Africa has always had the orange filter. Africa has always had the flies on children's mouths. Africa has always had the perception of being a dark continent, the perception of being full of disease, violence, and poverty. And while they are interesting and accurate conversations to have about all of those problems, the one-dimensional narrative that is told about Africa from the Western perspective is one that is not helpful to Africa and misses on the nuance of the beauty, the potential, the vitality, the energy, and the robust stuff that is happening in Africa even now as we speak. If you then think about what then happens when news is consolidated in terms of funding only from the Western perspective, that does mean that the African voices, the African perspective platforms, such as even this podcast, will not penetrate global audiences because, it takes a while to build that level of scale. And even if you think about it further, some of the best journalism in recent years has come from alternative and specialized platforms. If you think about America, you have platforms such as Vox, platforms such as 538, The Intercept, Axios. These platforms have been creating news in a different way from CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. And in fact, sometimes people have been going there first as opposed to going to legacy media. So when there is this massive push to the funding of institutional and Western-based news desks, this could really exclude the potential of that ecosystem being formed in Africa, a startup news ecosystem, an alternative news provision ecosystem, not an alternative news in the fake news sense, but in the term of that, having these different perspective, street level, grassroots level perspectives, having content created in a similar way to what we saw in America. So here's the conclusion of today's podcast episode. Here's the conclusion. African lawmakers need to start thinking about the impact of Facebook on the news industry in Africa and on democracies in Africa. 3 things need to happen. Number 1, they need to write laws determining how and when Facebook can remove political figures from the platform. I think that African states must create their own standards for that. It must not be left to Facebook to do, because if only Facebook gets to determine that, it may mean that people who are saying something of value from an African perspective could be removed because it is contra to an American worldview, American ideology, and American goals and aspirations on the foreign stage. Every state and its actors ought to be able to speak freely on the platforms of the globe. And I think without waiting for Facebook to come right, African leaders would have to do this. Number 2, they need to move aggressively to determine how Facebook can fund legacy media and emerging media platforms in their home countries. Number 3, they need to consider whether it's of value for Facebook News to be allowed in their regions. Because when Facebook gets to control the digital market and the news that is seen on their platform and who gets to speak on their platform, that could fundamentally alter the democratic model of fragile democracy, new democracies, and actually could reshape democracies in a way that exclude people on the ground and select winners and losers based on the preferences of international organizations and entities such as Facebook. And that's something that you don't want. You want democracy to be by the people, for the people. Ideally, these things should be done at an AU level, but it's unlikely. So what may need to happen is that robust and stable democracies should actually move ahead and pass these laws. Countries such as South Africa, Ghana, and Botswana, for example, could move ahead with this and set the example. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for America and the EU and Australia to do something for us to think, hey, that's a good idea. We should do that too in Africa. Africa can innovate on its own. Africa can think about legislative solution for challenges that it sees on the horizon on its own. So we mustn't necessarily say, okay, let's wait for America. Let's wait for so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so to verify this thinking before we roll it out. We should have the boldness to think of our own interventions and pursue them. So I think that this is something that can be done from the African perspective to make sure that some of the risks that we are seeing in the horizon from the actions of companies such as Facebook can be mitigated. I think it's worth considering. I hope that this whole presentation was fruitful to your thought process, helpful to your thought process. That's where we're going to leave it for today. This has been an episode of Josie to Lagos. Remember, if you love the podcast and you want to help other people find out about it, tweet about us, put a review on the podcast platform, Apple Podcast, whatever platform you're listening on. It helps people find the podcast. Till the next one.